Yes, thank you very much for this introduction. You did pronounce it correctly, thanks. Well, my initial reaction actually when I saw the topic of the panel, security and borders, I thought, well, this is not my topic. The EU's role in ensuring the security of borders is a topic which is undeniably important, but it's not really a major priority in our, let's say, northeastern corner of Europe. But I'm very happy that I have an opportunity here to actually zoom out from the border issue, and I think also zoom out a little bit from the kind of acute policy questions of today. I'm happy to engage in discussing them later, but to make some very general points to get us started. And just two major messages that I want to share. The first one is that we really need to work constantly on a shared strategic analysis among the member states of what are the major security concerns for Europe. And I share the position that has been made, or the point that has been made by actually several speakers before this panel today, that security is a major area that the EU needs to focus on. I would say it is also actually the most unifying area, although we all have our different priorities in different corners of Europe. But it needs constant work to have solidarity and to have a shared view. And the second message is that I think we have seen a pendulum swing in the way the EU approaches security, from being kind of very idealist, embracing the world and trying to transform countries outside the EU, into something in recent years that has become much more inward-looking, protective, defensive, and that has been, of course, the justified reaction to the events around us and the deteriorated security situation. But we have to ask the question, have we, as Europeans, have we lost this ambition to actually still try to shape the world around us and to try to influence the global order? So what is the level of ambition? Are we just now about protecting and defending ourselves, or are we also taking the broader look at how the global order is developing and where we could make a difference there? So on this strategic understanding and the threat perceptions, of course, it's very well known that there are persistent differences between the priorities of the eastern and southern member states. But actually, when we look at the level of public opinion, there is quite some basis for a shared approach, namely what happened as a result of the migration crisis, and also as a result of what we have seen in the southern neighborhood, the turbulence, what we have seen inside the EU, the terror attacks, and I'm sorry to put these things in the same sentence, but there are, of course, links between these issues. I'm not suggesting that they are about the same phenomenon. But what we, do you hear me in the back? Yeah, okay, maybe I should. So what we see in the opinion polls is that actually a clear majority of Europeans in all major member states consider Islamic extremism as a major threat and consider terrorism as a major threat. And this is then a basis to actually, for the EU to work on these issues together and engage all the member states. And also what we have seen in the past years is quite a remarkable unity in the way the EU has been approaching Russia. And although looking at the public debate, there is always speculation about which countries might be willing to drop the sanctions against Russia and whether there is unity in how we see this issue. We also heard from the Austrian representative today a very clear position that if the conflict goes on in the Donbass, if the conditions there don't change, the sanctions will be renewed. Although, of course, we have seen some less clear statements by the authorities of this country and some others recently. But so the picture is actually not that bad. And coming from Estonia, it's of course the increased kind of aggressiveness of Russia, which is a major concern. And it has been very important to see the leadership by Germany in generating consensus on the conflict in Ukraine and on how to approach Russia. Then again, France has been a key actor in shaping the policies towards the southern neighborhood. But we see also very concrete expressions of solidarity, such as the participation of a wide range of member states in different EU operations and other external operations. I can say for Estonia, for example, has been active in operations ranging from Iraq to Mali and under different frameworks. Also, contributions made to different EU activities and agencies. FRONTEXT is just one example. I can say that Estonia per capita contributes the highest amount to FRONTEXT, if I'm correct. So there are different ways to find expressions of solidarity. But we need foreign policy leaders to constantly make this case that our security is shared and we need to have an understanding for each other's concerns. And to mention Russia once more, I want to stress here that it's not just an issue for the Baltic states or for the neighbors of Russia, but what Russia is doing in Ukraine is a danger for the European security order. So we really need to see this as a common European concern. And then on my second point of this pendulum swing in the EU's approach to security towards a more inward-looking agenda, when we look back for a moment to the 1990s, I mean, that was the time of this end of the Cold War and the sudden improvement of European security, which then opened up the space for the EU to actually develop its own common foreign and security policy. And it was an exceptionally favorable period for Europe. There were no major challenges worldwide to the Western hegemony and also the liberal political and economic model. And at the same time, the reunification of Europe was a strategic goal that was shared by the EU and by the US. So we are living in a very different world today. And the change now feels very dramatic, but we can see a more gradual change actually since the early 2000s, where then the security environment did start to deteriorate, both in the south and in the east. And in the early 2000s, the EU was still at the peak of its transformative agenda through enlargement and also trying to extend the same agenda to the neighborhood policy. But since then, it has become more and more focused on protecting and defending oneself. And this has been very important to address issues that were neglected in the EU's agenda thus far. But I will end with this point that now that we are seeing around us actually major challenges to the rules-based global order, I think the EU has to think again more, not just about strengthening defense and strengthening protection of its borders and territories and citizens, but also about its influence on the global order. I'll stop there, thanks.
Thank you so much, Kristi. And I'll hand over to Nicoletta, who will talk about civilian protection, which is also one aspect of the whole Europe that protects, that is maybe not always stressed enough.
Well, yes, thank you, Catherine. Actually, I will talk about security intended as a comprehensive field in which both defense and civilian sides complement each other. And the idea is to reflect on the issue if security and defense can really be the last bastion against EU disintegration nowadays. So I will start briefly with the global context, second, how the European Union has reacted, and finally, a few suggestions on the way ahead. I will be quick. So, first of all, on the global context. Here, I think maybe I can quote a famous movie by Coen's brothers. This is not a word for the whole continent, meaning Europe, at least as it looks like now. Of course, if we, if we refer to the strategic reflection done by the High Representative, we know we are confronted with a more connected, contested, and complex world. And there are some major trends in the global context that are associated very clearly with security challenges that the European Union is facing. We know these challenges quite well. I refer to weak and failed states, to international crime and transnational criminal organization, information and cyber insecurity, and so on and so forth. So how does the new global context impact on EU security and defense? First of all, we have member states that are less willing and able to invest in the deployment of European Union missions abroad and are engaged in a long-term reduction of military capabilities. But at the same time, this trend and this ongoing crisis has also the potential to encourage some deeper integration in the security and defense field. And we have already seen this last year with the launch of the permanent structured cooperation. Second, there is the attitude of the new US administration to take into account, of course, the alleged disengagement of the United States. And this is important because this questions the main pillar of the transatlantic security system so far. And third, very important, the phenomena of international terrorism and illegal immigration that have increasingly the quest by European citizens of security provided by the European Union, exactly before they feel increasingly insecure and threatened. So at the first sight, the European Union seemed incapable to conduct a strategic reflection on these challenges and also more inclined to adopt a survival mode. We have seen this in Ukraine, in Libya, and in many other scenarios. However, I would be more positive on this because there are a number of indicators that suggest that starting from the Lisbon Treaty and also on the basis of the lessons learned, the US embarked in a process of modeling its strategic thinking and also acting. So how has the EU reacted to this mutated international landscape? The subtitle of this being Theory and Practice of a Global Actor in the Making. First of all, there was the adoption, the presentation by the High Representative of the EU Global Strategy in 2016 that came almost 13 years after the first and unique strategic document, the Solana's European Security Strategy, and a few days after Brexit. So, of course, the time was mature to put forward a deep reflection on what security meant for the European Union itself. Compared to 2003, the European Union has now become a recognized international security actor with 35 missions, military and civilian, deployed all over the world. However, it is fair to draw two main conclusions from the EU's previous practice. And one is that the European Union is still a military dwarf. This has been clear and has been also clearly marked by the propensity of the European Union to engage much more in the civilian field than in the military field. There are, of course, some political considerations on this, but also the inability of the European Union to have solid structures in Brussels. I'm talking about the lack of a headquarters, I'm talking about the limited military funding, I'm talking about the still limited military capabilities in many member states. Second main lesson learned from the practice of the European Union is if you can't do it, teach it. Because if you look at all the missions that the European Union has deployed recently, they've been mainly focused on assisting, advising, mentoring, training local authorities in performing tasks such as security sector reform, institution building, border management, development of national strategies. And we have just few exceptions, one being EULEX in Kosovo and the other UNAFOR Med in the Mediterranean. Again, here political considerations are at stake because, of course, the empowerment of partner countries in this field is an appealing concept, but on the other side also allow member states to take a safer place against accusations against scarce effectiveness or limited impact of the European Union itself. So the global strategy has recognized these shortfalls and has put forward a number of proposals in the civilian and in the defense field. In the defense field, we all know that 2017 was the year of European defense with the permanent structured cooperation, but also the launch of a first mechanism of cooperation and coordination among the defense ministers of the member states, the so-called CARD process, and also the European Defence Fund, which is for the first time a funding mechanism managed by the European Commission for military and defence matters. On the civilian side, 2018 will be the year to take a decisive leap forward for the European Union. A civilian capability development plan will be launched, a civilian compact which is exactly trying to focus on these new security challenges for the European Union. So, for example, hybrid threats, irregular migration, cyber, terrorism, radicalization, organized crime, border management. These are all functions that the new civilian crisis management of the European Union should be able to tackle. And this will be done through more flexible missions, hopefully with a closer cooperation with FRONTEXT and other agencies in the field of justice and home affairs. Of course, this is a great challenge, and it is on this basis that I put forward my recommendation for the Austrian presidency and for the TEPSA conference in these two fields. In particular, the idea to keep the political engagement high in the field of defense, because after the launch of this innovative mechanism, we have to demonstrate that we are able to deliver. And on the civilian side, the idea to really work on this interconnection between internal and external security to make crisis management something different from the past. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. Bernd Körner, I have a question for you. The Austrian government wants you to keep the borders closed. How do you do that? And what do you need the government to do during the presidency to do that better?
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation to an event that is, out of several reasons, quite memorable for me. I was for a long time a member of the Ministry of the Interior in Vienna, and I experienced 3 presidencies from the other side. And after the 3rd presidency, I was wondering, where will I be when the next presidency comes? And now we have the point, and I will be representing the European Border and Coast Guard Agency, FRONTEXT. I will be on the other side, and I will definitely refrain from giving directly or indirectly good advice. because my prime task as Deputy Executive Director is to represent the agency and to follow the tasks and objectives that we are supposed to follow as senior executive management in the agency. The agency as such, and allow me to spend 2 minutes on the agency, is not that old. We are one of the several decentralized EU agencies, and we were founded in 2004. We have our seat in Warsaw, and we have currently a staffing level of 589, which are all based in Warsaw. And whenever somebody says, let Frontex solve it, and I was already welcomed today by one of you by saying, oh, you represent Frontex, you're everything from part of the problem to part of the solution. Whenever we have to deal with something, we have to do this together with pledges and deployments that we receive from the member states. The concept we are following is we are together the European Border and Coast Guard. We have a shared responsibility, and we both work on that. So it is not possible that a member state says, let's Frontex do it. Frontex cannot do it without the member states. How do we do it? Currently, we have roughly 1,000 up to 200 up to 1,500 border guards out in the fields every week. In peak times, it might go up to 1,700, hopefully not to 2,000, because this would be an all-time high that we would reach this year. Why do I say hopefully not? Because 3 years ago, we were still at a weekly average of 300 to 500, which already shows what change has border management been undergoing and what different importance has been given to border management and also preserving internal security as part of a supposedly first filter. Before I come a little bit to the actions or activities or competencies that we have, let me for 1 minute go back. Our first title was Agency for the Coordination of the Measures of the Member States at the External Borders of the European Union. Particular emphasis on coordination, particular second emphasis on risk analysis in order to constitute the basis to undertake informed decisions, and training. Let's say those were the 3 pillars that we were originally built on. We were far away from taking over particular tasks in law enforcement or internal security or cross-border crime. This was a coordinating instrument that has grown in importance and size tremendously and very fast until we then had the migration crisis. In the migration crisis, several things happened, and I would go way beyond the 10 minutes that were given to me. But as a result of the migration crisis and as a result of an internal evaluation, we got a completely new regulation, and now we are the European Border and Coast Guard together with the member states as far as they perform border controls. So the scope goes much beyond border guards. We also cooperate with customs. We cooperate with fishery control. We cooperate with maritime safety. We cooperate all together following the example of a European Union integrated border management model. What does this mean? It means that we all work together at the border and in accordance with the so-called 4-tier access control model, starting way before a problem reaches the border, in collecting intelligence, in participating in capacity building projects, in working together with missions, as we were already mentioned before from my speaker, in order to have liaison officers deployed and collect as much information as possible so that when the problem or the issue or the migration flow or regular flow of passengers arrives at the border, we know what is coming and where it's coming from. At the border, then, we have to not only look at the fulfillment of the entry conditions. We are more and more also getting involved in cross-border crime as a first filter. I may illustratively mention that together with Europol, in the last year, we have managed to apprehend roughly 200 traffickers from our own initiative by collecting information, collecting personal data, and conducting interviews according to our regulation, and by moving those data sets onto Interpol and to Europol, so that they then searched in their databases, and the result was an apprehension of an organizer, a facilitator, a trafficker that was responsible for organizing the irregular migration flows. I may illustratively also mention, to underline the cooperation with customs, that last year we have had detections of 137 tons of narcotics in all of the Frontex supported operations. So we go much beyond the classical border surveillance or much beyond the classical border control. We are also massively engaged in cross-border crime issues. We also got the Coast Guard functions. The Coast Guard functions meaning that especially in the Mediterranean basin, we fulfill certain Coast Guard functions together with our sister agencies, Maritime Safety and Fishery Control. To put it in short, before we were patrolling with 3 vessels, each one following its own task. Now we patrol with 1 vessel, working together, live streaming the results and analyzing them in all 3 agencies so everybody can take out the results that he needs for his actions. We base this, as I already said, on risk analysis. We have then at the end freshly initiated as quality control instrument vulnerability assessment, which means that we also now constantly monitor the performance level in order to find out whether there are weaknesses that need to be remedied, that should be closely looked at, or that even might require, in worst case scenarios, specific actions, meaning so-called rapid border interventions, meaning that in a sense of solidarity, we move in to support the country to cope with the massive pressure, irregular situation, weakness that has been detected. And last not least, in the sense of orderly migration management, we also got the competence to, in a much bigger scale, support in the field of return. Migration management and border management goes from checking the arrivals, but also, as far as our field of competence is concerned, being there at the end when national decisions have been made according to the rules, all national remedies have been exploited, and it has been decided by national decision that a particular third country national does not have any right to stay. Then the country can approach us to return us, to assist them in return, and we offer the necessary support for return. The figures have rocketed. We had 10 years ago 18 flights with roughly 3,000 returnees, and we had last year 341 flights with 14,700 returnees, and the figures this year are also going up. To sum up and not exploit the 10 minutes, we have greatly enhanced our mandate. We have tried to expand in our activities. We are much more also involved now in cross-border crime issues, in tackling this, in finding out reasons and particular cases related to terrorism. Border management, if I look at it, how it has developed from the beginning in 1990, when I entered a border management service, I have to say today has nothing to do anymore with what it is today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, we have Wolfgang Wessels, and he will also be talking about one of the relatively new instruments, namely PESCO.
My first point is I have a new research subject for my PhD student, just to follow, just to see what happens there. No, I mean that serious. I mean, we must know much more about what is happening. This doesn't work. No, perhaps. Okay, so everybody who is younger here could go to see me and him to see what kind of research you should do together. That's, I think, a major point. And I would come back shortly to what you said. I quoted that you enhanced your mandate was enhanced. And of course, all those looking at political science theory, which, spillover. Spillover. Neo-functionalists proved again. Because we heard today also from some that there is a post-neo-functionalist who would say neo-functionalist doesn't work anymore because there's a lack of permissive consensus. There was a statement in this, which, I mean, permissive consensus certainly has changed. One point I want always to raise, and I know that this is counterintuitive, but challenging, what is really new? So we know already what has changed with you. For me, the starting point is the 70s, because when we looked at, or I look at PESCO now, I found myself, what did we do in the 70s? We looked what is called European political cooperation, yeah? Which was a very informal way to work. There was no treaty base. Now we have a treaty base, but it looks a little bit like EPC at that time, you know, even worse, because the presidency doesn't play a large role. There are leading nations or lead nations who are taking up the task in PESCO for the 17 tasks so far. In terms of the security threat, to be frank, this looked bad at that time. I mean, if you counted the tanks on the other side of the Elbe, and on our side of the Elbe, I was there, a soldier drafted there, that looked very promising. We had this joke when the officers told, what would you do if the rat attacks you? Our answer was, next station, trip to Zurich, one way. You know, that was our answer at that time. No, security, and also one of the other issues which were clearly there, how to deal with the US. Yeah, that was, because the US had different defense, deterrence, and the way of getting to some kind of agreement. And this was not always the same like the Europeans, or at least like the Germans had at that time. So there were always different ways. So the issue of Russian threat and of the US, relation with the US was already clearly there. You know, and we have to see what changed, of course. I won't say it's just a copy, or we need to copy, but I think we need to see it's a long period already, which developed. As a small footnote, the term security was totally forbidden at the first years. Then came economic dimension of security, and then political dimension of security, and then in the Maastricht Treaty, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, it was European defense, even promised to have a European defense. It's in Maastricht Treaty and the Lisbon Treaty, a very, let's say, far-reaching goal, which I don't know very much liked in this country here, in this point. So, the history of development, where are we in this? And I would very much take up your point, because I think we could see a certain pattern, that member states started with a very loose intergovernmental cooperation, yeah? Because they realized we have common problems. But why should we involve any more supranational institution? Why should we have legal texts? We just come together and talk to each other. The Trevi Group was, this European political cooperation was the same, you know. The meeting of foreign ministers and their high civil servants, or Minister of Interior Justice, that's sufficient. They will find a way. They found out that this doesn't work. And already in the Maastricht Treaty, we have a new way, common foreign and security policies. Also, the third pillar led to more, let's say, still very dirty communitarization, very dirty communitarization. Lisbon Treaty, in the area of justice and home affairs, is more or less a communitarization. Yeah? There are some exceptions to that. The Court of Justice is not allowed to do everything, and there might be a veto power for certain policy areas for member states. So it's, let's say, here and there, not perfect in the view of community orthodoxy. Yep, you, as a lawyer, you, I think, represent for me the community orthodoxy, which is a compliment, Yeah, it's a compliment. So let's say, it's still, in this sense, not perfect, but it moves in this direction. And you just reconfirm the trend. Yeah? And here what we see is what I call the problem-solving instinct of member states. Somehow they realize we have to do things together. At the same time, it's a sovereignty reflex, but not too much, and how can we do that? Now I come to PESCO, because I thought that I could offer you something on PESCO. I can read out the 17 measures which they have agreed upon. No, I shouldn't. I found out that Austria is very rarely in the group of countries who want to cooperate. Cyber attack you are in, and let's say military disaster founding. Otherwise, there are other countries.
one point I found then, I was looking, trying to find, I don't know anything about any of these things which are happening, you know. How are they cooperating? Who is getting when together? What is the role of the High Representative? Quite clear, there's no role for the Commission, at least that's the first point, perhaps indirectly over the European Defence Fund, which is coming up. That might be a way already into it. By the way, the same, it worked with the EPC. At the beginning, the member of the Commission, we were told by the persons then at the time, were not invited to the meetings. Then they were invited to meetings, for example, in Africa, where they were AKP. Diplomats thought perhaps not bad to have those people who give money at the round. They were always excluded from the luncheons, because luncheons were highly political sensitive, you know, where foreign ministers were. And now it's starting to be here the same in the area. And in PESCO, not yet. PESCO is still not in this point. My point here is what we see might be something like what we call the Monet method. For those, you should reread what is the basis of our European holiday, the Schuman Declarations, 9th of May, you know, limited but real progress, yeah? Which leads to a higher degree of solidarity, yeah? And perhaps a federation in the future. You know, this is very clearly written there. Yeah, very clearly written there. And I think that's what we see in all this area. You know, that member states started because of problem solving to look for concrete steps. They don't have a clue really, and I think I like that about the strategy. I know it's very vague formulations there, which, you know, in political terms, we can understand that nobody makes a larger degree of commitment, but that individual steps, the missions are taken. Now, the PESCO 17 project and the Austrian presidency will have the task, or in the Austrian presidency, there will be another 10 projects, I think, being concluded or agreed upon by the Council. So I think it's a step-by-step process, which leads to more, if you want the classical term, communitarization, more involvement of EU actors. Here we have the High Representative. Of course, there's a long debate, is she's more supranational or more intergovernmental, but let's say there is a step towards this, in this direction. The overall question, of course, which came up with both of you and with you, is this sufficient? Is this sufficient? Is this a little bit just window dressing? And my point there is we have the PESCO rules since the Lisbon Treaty, 2009. We could have applied that in the Libya case. Would have been a crucial point. We didn't apply, or member states didn't apply that for the bombing of Syria a couple of weeks ago. And of course, we also understand why this is not the case, because there's one country, which is a neighboring country to you, which have more or less the same language. I'm sorry? Who could that language country be? That's a country where I never understood what kind of coffees they have. I mean, they have so many sort of coffees. So this country is not too much interested in that, out of good historical reasons. So it's not just bad mood necessarily, but if you look at the reactions of Merkel on the Syrian bombing, the first thing she would have to do would to call the Bundestag to talk about it. And then, I mean, the things in military terms doesn't work like that, at least as far as I understand. So I think we are here faced with, is the step-by-step process in your area, in foreign policy, in the missions, let's say, sufficient? We learn, apparently all people learn. I think there's a general learning by doing. That's already helpful, but is this sufficient? And that will be seen more by history later on to see, is this a good step forward? My general recommendation would be a lot of very interesting subjects for research. So, and looking here at TEPSA and all the TEPSA Institute, a lot of good subjects for applying for funds. And that would be for research funds. So that's the optimistic side. If my general statement is optimistic, I'm doubtful. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. What I would like to do is go straight into into the discussion and invite questions or comments from the audience. The only thing I would ask you is maybe keep them slightly shorter at the beginning so that we can, get a bit of a discussion going. That would be lovely. And someone needs to be the first. Yes, please. Can you just give the microphone 1 second?
Okay, so I'm one of the oldest people here.
Yeah, we are.
You too.
Yeah, veterans.
Veterans. As a veteran, I start, and I simply want to sort of say discuss what Wolfgang Wessels just said. There was a few weeks ago there was a conference in Brussels about the European foreign policy, external relations, which was organized by a former student of mine. So I said I will participate. There was a huge conference with 400 people, and I presented a paper there, updating my research about the cohesion of the EU member states in the United Nations General Assembly. This old study. And I did it for the 2016-2017 General Assembly. And my surprise was there was no more consensus among the EU member states than in the last 10 or 15 years. So there was an uptick in consensus during the 1990s. We heard today already that in the 1990s the integration was very positive, but since then you have stagnation of consensus in foreign policy issues, at least, which are discussed in the UN General Assembly. And the two groups of countries which have different positions were always France and the United Kingdom. This is clear now, the United Kingdom will be gone. But then you have, quote unquote, a new group of countries with an own security policy in voting on these security issues in the United Nations General Assembly. It's the neutral and non-aligned countries. So my also a bit pessimistic view on furthering the consensus among the EU member states in foreign policy, because up to now you have to have consensus to be really active and can act as an actor in international relations, is the consensus. And this is still not there and has not changed very much in the last 15 years or so. And in particular, because I'm coming from Austria, I have the problem with these non-aligned countries because they have a special position inside the European Union and they seem to support this. So I'm quite pessimistic with PESCO because there you have, again, the non-aligned and neutral countries as members. And I don't know how this will work. Excuse me for my length, but I have to show my research.
Yes, I wanted to ask a question to Bernd Körner regarding border control. There are some countries within the European Union who have a constant inclination to dedicate their political discourse to security issues and in particular to all these migration routes. And now that we have the opportunity to have you here, I wanted to ask you if you can share with us some of the numbers of how urgent the issue is at the moment and what are the most solicited or the most used migration routes at the moment towards the EU. Thank you.
Do you maybe want to? Yes, directly on that. Yes, sure.
Because it's on the same direction. I also want to ask you, Mr. Kramer, just on this new mandate of the Austrian border, the Border and Coast Guard, the right to intervene in national politics in case of weaknesses, etc., etc. What is the first experience of the Coast Guard in this area, which was considered to be really step forward in order to be linked to national responsibilities with regard to external borders?
Frontex related. Okay, then we'll collect one more and then we'll get into it.
No, just a technical question. Coast Guard operations in the Mediterranean, I speak from a Greek point of view, but could be also Italian. When you go down to pushbacks, how could that really happen? Because a pushback at sea is drowning people. It's extremely efficient because once one is drowned, they don't come ashore, but it's also a little extreme.
Thank you. Bernd, do you want to start?
Thank you very much for the questions. I may start with the number 3. And we both know that it's on. Should be on. And we both know that according to Regulation 656 out of 2014, there are severe restrictions on returning to third countries, which immediately puts an obstacle to all those running discussions about why do we always bring them to European Union external borders, why do we not return them? Ladies and gentlemen, we are working according to the rules. And if somebody would like to change the rules, then I think, please, we should follow the right order, then first change the rules, and then let us follow the new rules. For the time being, there's the 656, and the 656 puts us into a clear frame. To answer it in short, we both know that pushbacks are forbidden by all means. Okay? That's the first part. The second part, right to intervene, I'm going backwards with the questions, right to intervene, vulnerability assessment. I admit that the expectations in theory were higher than in practice, but the first year of vulnerability assessment has been successfully implemented. I think the reality check will be year number 2, because in the first year we were working on the methodology and the implementation at the same time. So we were answering why and what at the same time. We have successfully implemented the selection of the indicators. We have successfully implemented all 28 baseline assessments. So we got the indicators and we are regularly evaluating the development of the indicators. We have successfully followed up in particular cases where indicators have shown us anomalies with simulation exercises in order to verify what's actually going on there. And we have successfully followed up with recommendations, and we have monitored the implementation of those recommendations. So there have been achievements. There have also been delays, and there have also been extreme delays, and those delays and extreme delays are being followed up according to the rules. What has been particularly interesting is a last instrument that has been developed in this context. This is this emerging threat assessments. What does this mean? If somebody reads something, if somebody gets an information, there is something strange, we can ad hoc immediately start an investigation, ask for clarification, perform on-site visits, and follow up on that particular issue with recommendations, with activities, or after having checked it, then close the case and say, well, received, checked, clear, closed. So the expectations were a bit higher for the first year than actually realized. The result was promising. We are in the middle of the second round of vulnerability assessments, and we do hope really to make progress, because this is contrary to this peer review exercise in Schengen evaluations and regularly ongoing annual exercise where all member states are screened more or less on a permanent basis. Coming back as question number 3 to the first question, the migration situation currently. The migration situation currently is, in a broad context and in simple terms, that way more than 95% of the cases are in the Mediterranean basin. That compared to what we have in the Mediterranean basin, the land border to the east or the airports are more or less very, very low. This does not mean that they are not interesting, because, for example, at the airports, we are having more and more problems with biometric passports, where the passports per se are being genuine and without any alterations, but they are being used by lookalikes. So somebody comes, and when you look at the picture and you look at the person, you say, well, probably a few years old, but it could be him or it could be her. But in fact, it is a completely different passport, but the way from the picture to the biometric identifiers is in harmony and not interfered. The second problem is that we have detected the first cases where we had intrusions in the biometric identifiers, which means that apparently there are already techniques in the market where you can even break biometric identifiers. But this remains to be further checked. We have had a handful of cases so far, but we are following up on that. The land borders are to the east, low profile in a modus operandi as we have had them already for a long time. The Mediterranean basin is divided by between three migration routes. This is the Eastern Mediterranean, the Central Mediterranean, and the Western Mediterranean route. The Central Mediterranean route has decreased, which is a good sign. Cases we could talk at length. The bad sign is that the points of departure have been widened up. It's no longer Libya, Italy. It is also Tunisia. It is also Algeria. And it was, for a certain amount of time, also Egypt. So it became much wider. The situation in Libya as such remained more or less unchanged, but slightly improved. We are working together with UNAFOR Med Sofia in training fields, where we try to get a grip on the Libyan Coast Guard in order to build up independent capacity, but this is a long process. The Eastern Mediterranean route is slightly increasing, but still under control. What is, I think, if I take an educated guess, at the core of the question of is what is following up after the Eastern Mediterranean route, namely at the Western Balkans. The classical Western Balkan route via Serbia, Croatia, or Serbia-Hungary is more or less frozen at the middle level. The parallel route, for the time being, has an assessment of roughly being between 5,000 and 6,000 in total. This is the total number of irregular border crossings from northern of Greece via Albania, Montenegro, Bosnia, Croatia. So we do have a route that is, from empirical status, clearly identifiable, but we do have a route that is of absolutely low level. As we speak, there's a conference going on in Sarajevo where ministers and also representatives from the agency are meeting to agree on measures that can be done. So we are trying to keep that under control, although at this moment it is very low level. Western Mediterranean route, to conclude, increasing but at a lower level, because due to the increases in activities at the Central Mediterranean route, there's a deviation via Morocco. Also, the ECOWAS region has been enlarged, namely Morocco has joined the ECOWAS, so there's a free movement area now that has been expanded, and it's therefore quite easy for traffickers and organizers to bring people up to the Moroccan shore to then cross to Spain, either east or west of the Strait of Gibraltar. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Just very quickly on PESCO connected to the issue of consensus, because, I mean, PESCO was born exactly to address the lack of consensus among member states, and also recognizing the differentiated landscape we have in terms of defense and national interest in Europe. So the very idea was really to give incentives to member states to plan together, to operate together on specific priorities. Now, due to the different visions about PESCO, particularly France on one side and Germany on the other, we ended up with a PESCO at 25, which was not exactly what was meant to be at the beginning. Can this be really the game changer in the European defense? Well, if we look at the projects that were proposed, the 17 priority actions, I would say no. There is really nothing new, nothing that could not be done even beyond PESCO, except maybe for the project on military mobility, which is something very interesting. However, I would say that, I mean, the possibility for PESCO to be really something new has to be identified in this triangle that I was mentioning before. So PESCO on one side, on the other side the opportunity to link PESCO to national and European capability planning through this card mechanism, and on the other side to connect the PESCO projects with the European Defence Fund, so to give member states the opportunity to coordinate and also to rely on funds of the European Commission to carry out some projects in the European framework, instead of doing the same thing at a pure intergovernmental level outside the European Union.
Yes, to continue actually on this same issue, I mean, member states have very different ideas of what EU defense policy should be doing. The non-aligned countries were mentioned, but having spent the past 7 years in Finland, I have to stress that there is no coherent group of non-aligned countries. Finland has become one of the most active supporters of strengthening EU defense policy. But at the same time, it is not at all clear to the Finnish public either what exactly is it that EU defense brings to the picture. And the main concern, of course, for countries in the east and north in the current geopolitical situation is territorial defense. We are back to the very basic concerns. And here the EU, this is what the EU defense policy is not supposed to do. And one thing that has not been mentioned so far is the deepening of EU-NATO cooperation and this very strong consensus in Europe that whatever is done in EU defense cooperation is complementary to NATO, is not competing, is not undermining NATO. And it's still NATO that is taking care of territorial defense. And yet, Finns and some other countries are very interested in also seeing what the EU can contribute by supporting capability developments and certain operational readiness. Plus also the question of the Article 42.7. How would that be implemented if it were activated by a member state in a crisis where actually there would be a mixture of different threats, including military and non-military? So what would the EU do in that situation? The NATO would have to be engaged as well. How would EU and NATO cooperate? So there are a lot of questions that have not really been clearly answered, and the EU has a way to go to develop its own implementation mechanism for these treaty provisions that are kind of claiming that the member states actually are supposed to help defending each other. And actually the practical defense cooperation, a lot of it is going on outside EU framework, like the French European Intervention Initiative, which maybe eventually will become a part of PESCO, but that's something that we don't know yet. And this brings me to one more general point, and now I'm really getting into I think, dangerous territory. I have Wolfgang Wessels next to me with this huge book of EU treaties, but I want to challenge a bit his claim that what we are seeing in European security and defense policy is communitarization. Because what I see is rather deeper cooperation, but member states very much sticking to their sovereignty to ultimately take the decisions. And in that sense, it's not really about deepening integration, it's deepening cooperation. And this is then quite something different. And we see on the practical level something you might call integration even of defense forces and capabilities, joint procurements, joint exercises, kind of interdependence that goes very deep and in a very practical level. But when it comes to actually taking decisions on whether to use military force, it's the national capitals that do it. I'll stop there.
Thank you. I have a number of questions. And then I'll put you in this round. So we have Juha, we have Bernd, we have...
It's a question of clarification.
Okay. So I'd still like to go in the same order. And then finally there was a question here. So if we take these four quickly, and if you could try to be as succinct as possible, sort of to get the discussion going.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Thank you for the panelists. Just a very quick question. I would like to perhaps follow up what Kristi was talking about, the EU turning inwards and how effectively EU is still focusing on global affairs, also the neighborhood. I think this inwards turning analysis is widely shared among the analysts and also correct in many respects. But then on the other hand, there is still quite a lot what the EU is doing outside of its borders. Let's take the security and border control, and I think that's always joined or combined with the neighborhood policy and also development policy. What we perhaps have seen recently is that, and this is something that we have worked together with Kristi also earlier, is that the EU has brought a harder edge to its external relations beyond its borders. The sanctions against Russia, more conditionality in terms of neighborhood and also development policy. But my question would be in a way that how well prepared the EU is to bring this harder edge to its external policies when we know the divisions within the Union, and also what would that require to EU to be transformative power or to some extent sort of defensive power when it comes to the global order and the rules-based order. That's kind of my question. What would be nice to hear the views of the panelists.
I'm sorry, we're always going on about the microphone. It's not only so that those in the back can hear, but that we also have good audio for the recording.
My question is on PESCO. As mentioned, it's a good area of research, but also it's an interesting area of research in the context of flexibility, flexible cooperation and integration. And when I look at the discussions within that context, flexibility is discussed within the context of EU member states, and PESCO is an arrangement among the EU member states. And this is a reflection of, let's say, the limits of differentiation or the debate on differentiation. It's a reflection of that debate, and as Kristi mentioned, it is also a reflection of the inward-looking orientation within the EU. But when I look at the arrangement, there is also the potential to include third countries. Is there a possibility to go from, let's say, inside to the outside, or to the, to the candidate countries, to the third countries? Is there a possibility to go from so-called internal differentiation to external differentiation, which is probably quite interesting, And in general, could security be, European security could be only discussed inside the Euro, inside the EU,
My question is on Frontex. With respect to the flows, I understood that the mix between the central, eastern, and western routes has changed. But has there been an overall decline, which I understood that overall there was a decline.
Yes.
Right. Now, have you identified the causes of this decline? I mean, the probable causes of the decline?
So I would have one statement and one question. If pushing back migrants to Libya is illegal, then helping Libyans to do the same is also illegal. Second, my question would be, how has the relationship of the African Union and the European Union changed through the agenda of the European Union to restrict freedom of movement on the African continent?
Could you repeat the first sentence? I was a bit late.
It was just a personal analysis that if pushing back migrants or asylum seekers to Libya is illegal, then helping Libyans to do the same is similarly also illegal.
I think we'll start the first round, and again, just keep in mind that we might want to have a few last second questions. Who wants to start?
Should I?
Please.
Okay, for those who have not the treaty with them, I'm not a lawyer, and perhaps therefore I need the treaty. I just read your sentence. This is article, paragraph 7 of Article 42. If a member state is a victim of armed aggression on its territory, the other member state shall have towards it an obligation of aid and assistance by all the means in their power. Article 5, Washington NATO Treaty. Yeah? It's more or less the same. There are slight differences. And in accordance with Article 51, that's the self-defense. So that's quite going far. So, and always you have to read the second sentence. This shall not prejudice the specific character of the security defense policy of certain member states. Paul, who is that? I was told by Austrian lawyers that only this half sentence made Austria accept this treaty. Otherwise, they would not have ratified the treaty. That they can do what they want. And the next sentence is also very interesting. Commitments and cooperation in this area shall be consistent with commitments under the North Atlantic Treaty. So all the rest can also do what they want. So the first sentence is a very ambitious goal, trying to create something like an EU security as far as as far as NATO is going, but these next two sentences makes that rather a weak point. And by the way, this is repeated again in the protocol. Therefore, I just read it again, because, Katrin, I offered her to look at PESCO, and then I had to start and to understand that. That was a very good, let's say, function of this meeting here. And I have to reread the whole thing, and again in the protocol it's repeated this sentence. Yeah? So it's quite clear that there is a limit to the commitments which are there. So I think we should be aware of this kind of restriction, that there is an overall objective. It's even a common defense policy. It's written in the treaty since Maastricht, to have a common defense. Not directly, but there needs to be a decision by the European Council and then ratification, etc. And we all know that this is not possible in the moment. On the neutral countries I just follow, I would have said the same like you, but you can say that much clearer, that Austria might be a specific case, perhaps to a certain degree Ireland, but I think also Sweden and Finland like to be part of some kind of multilateral defense cooperation. At least that's what I heard, and you confirmed that very clearly on the Finnish case. So I would not say that all neutral or non-aligned countries would have this kind of a little bit hesitant position. Yeah?
In my data, Finland is the exception. They have neutral non-aligned the same outside line, and Finland goes to the mainstream of the EU.
Yeah. Then I would take up Attila's point, and see that Fundertaking is sitting next to him, who is a big expert on differentiated integration and flexibility. For all those who want to understand flexibility, you have to look at her map, because she has a map of... If you understand that within, let's say, 2 weeks, then you are brilliant. You are nearly Einstein. And I don't know how long it took you to draft this and to change it each time. So it's so complex and different, the differentiated integration. Who is in, where, and how. Turkey is, for example, in the customs union. Yeah? And so that's part of EU policy in general, and they are subject to EU decisions.
So I would claim, and that would be an interesting point, that PESCO is a new generation of enhanced and differentiated cooperation, because it has 2 or 3, compared with enhanced cooperation, it says countries who are willing, that's quite clear, but also able, and they have to follow criteria for the protocols. And there we have, of course, the doubt that this is taken seriously. You are right, with 25 countries, I'm not quite certain how strong Luxembourg really contributes to the defense of Europe and what kind of military composition they have. And indeed, I heard the same, that the Germans want to have everybody on board, except for the Danish, who are, let's say, by their constitutional agreement or by their referendum after the Maastricht Treaty blocked for that, and Malta, I think, is the second one, which is, I don't know out of which reason, is not member. So, let's say, as they're all members, I just wonder if this objective ability criteria really works in this sense. But there is also the possibility, and that's new, that you can kick out countries who don't fulfill anymore their obligations. And there's a yearly review, peer review, for doing that. Now I just wonder who is doing that. You mentioned peer reviews, and what kind of conclusions they would draw at the end to see, yeah, this country fulfills. I mean, Germany is known that it doesn't fulfill the rules of NATO. And we have somebody on the other side of the Atlantic who doesn't miss any opportunity to mention that, you know. So I don't know what will be the final peer review result of that. But that's different. You can kick out somebody, which is new in this area. Yeah? You can kick out somebody in this area, which is, let's say, a different point. Yeah. Last point, our let's say, point of conflict about looking, is communitarization or not? The starting point, if you look at the treaty, it's quite clear, I totally agree, it's a perfect situation of intergovernmentalism. Yeah? Nearly perfect, because it's member states are the leading, but there are starting points of communitarization, and there I draw a little bit from what I just heard here, that step by step, you know, first is that the European Defence Fund is there. I don't know what, but there is a European part, a community part. I just wonder what the European Parliament will do with that. So let's say that's one point. The other one, that there's some major responsibility, not with a rotating presidency, because it doesn't exist anymore in CFSP, but with a high representative. Now you might argue this is just a Secretary General, like with NATO, etc., so no really further than trying to have a little bit cooperation. But let's say that's to be seen. So I think the status quo is quite clear intergovernmental. But if you look at the process and take other examples, you might see this is a next step towards a little bit more communitarization. But I mean, that has to be seen. And I mean, this is speculation to large scale. Last point, as always, is it sufficient? And here I have my doubts. Okay.
Thank you. Does who of you else wants to come in?
If I continue a bit more on this Article 42.7, and thanks for reading it. As we know, it has been activated once so far by France. And what we saw then was that the implementation was about member states negotiating on a bilateral basis with each other about how they contribute and how they help France. And here is then the question, is this supposed to be the only way of implementing it, or should there be more of a role also for the EU institutions to be involved in possible future cases of activation of this clause? And this is where Finland, among others, has been quite actively pushing the EU forward. Then I pick up two of the questions. One, Juha's question, is the EU prepared to bring the harder edge? And of course, there are very many ways to bring a harder edge, but I will pick up two points here. One is, I think there is a scope to be bolder in still supporting transformation where there is domestic demand for it. And there are not too many places around Europe where we have this kind of situation now, but Ukraine is a good example where you have a certain pro-reform constituency domestically, and people who belong to that pro-reform constituency either in government or among civil society, they think that the EU has been far too kind of timid and weak in pushing for reforms. So this is one example of kind of, if you wish to call it harder edge, but combining it with this kind of still transformative agenda in places where it is possible. And another quite different way to have a harder edge, what we have seen in the EU's reaction to the Russian aggression against Ukraine is that the EU has been imposing a cost on grave violations of certain core norms of European security. And the EU has means to impose cost. I mean, it is not prepared to react militarily in most cases, but it has other ways to impose a cost, or at least to begin with, to take a clear position. But here, the picture is not very, very good. I mean, if we look more globally, look at China, for example, and China's actions in the South China Sea, the EU has not really been able to take a clear position there. And we are seeing this kind of creeping, growing influence of China through its economic presence, which then blocks the EU from taking these normative positions that it should really take on the basis of its global strategy and the kind of overall idea of its role in the world. And finally, very briefly on this differentiation, Brexit has not been mentioned, I think, so far, surprisingly. But I mean, that's really what will test then the flexibility, how the EU will manage to include the UK in whatever future defense cooperation, and I think there is a lot of will among member states to actually go as far as possible and be very creative. And something kind of comparable we see with Finland's and Sweden's relationship to NATO, where they try to get as close as possible without becoming members. I'll stop there.
Okay, a couple of points also from my side. First of all, on differentiation, of course, there are external aspects of differentiation which are crucial to be addressed specifically in the defense field and specifically connected to Brexit, because it is undeniable that the security and defense chapter is one of the most sensitive in the relationship between the European Union and the United Kingdom. And there, of course, I mean, both parties agree that we should find ways to keep the United Kingdom as close as possible to the European Union and to allow the United Kingdom to participate even in PESCO projects. However, there is, of course, the elephant in the room, which is the governance issue and the decision-making. And there, it has been clear on the side of the European Union that even those that will participate in security and defense project will not be allowed, because they are not member states, to take decisions over the prioritization of projects, initiatives, and so on and so forth. So, of course, this will be the main issue to be addressed by the two parties. On this dialogue on communitarization and intergovernmentalism, I see a tension going on also at the European Union level, and this tension is very clear between the European Commission on one side and the member states and other more intergovernmental actors, including the European Defence Agency. It is clear that the European Commission is taking a strong position to communitarize as much as possible the defense field through the European Defence Fund, and also through projects to create a Directorate General for Defence, which should be really something new in the European landscape. On the other side, member states are resisting to this tendency by this undeniable that the European institutions will have a greater role in PESCO and in general in the defense field compared to the past, including in checking if member states are compliant with the commitments that they undertake under PESCO. Finally, I think that there are two main dossiers that the European Union should be able to tackle at this time to demonstrate to the world that it can still shape the global security environment. And if I can name that, one is the Iran nuclear deal, and there the role of the High Representative and the European Union will be really tested. And the other one is the trade field and the trade battle, which is ahead of us. It is a bit ironic that both of them are with our traditional transatlantic ally, but this is a sign of the new international landscape. Thanks.
Yes.
Briefly, causes of decline, I would not dare to say at this moment decline. There are changes up and down, but I would not dare at all to describe that any decrease is an actual decline. Because we have had initiatives in the Libyan region towards the sub-Saharan region that were led by the UNHCR and IOM. We have had the EU-Turkey statement. We have had measures undertaken in the Western Balkan area that have, and that's how I would prefer to describe it, have frozen the situation at a certain level with some ups and downs. Because let's not face it, we have, I don't know why, but we have avoided one particular topic that is hindering measures in all different routes that we have described so far, and that's the question of asylum. We are waiting for a common European asylum system. We have thousands of migrants in asylum procedures, stuck in different areas, and until we can solve the asylum procedures in a sufficient level, we will not be able to change that severely in any field. Second issue, to also contribute to the communitarization discussion, but this time from my perspective, I just want to mention it also, we have basically the same discussion because we have an increase in challenges, we have an increase in requests for deployments, but we do not get the numbers. That's the reason why now the proposals came along in the context of the multi-annual financial frameworks that Frontex should be equipped with 10,000 border guards as a standing corps. This was a political statement. For the time being, we don't have a proposal. But also here we have the discussion between the member states and the Commission. The Commission says we need member states, but we don't want to give up our sole rights towards our border section or a section of the external border. We want to keep that under control, and that's us being in the lead. You can support, but we are in the lead. Those two things will also not match. And also here there will be a bit of a different but discussion breaking off. Third discussion concerning Libya. I'm fully on your side that the situation in Libya is tremendously difficult and tremendously critical and will require probably years of work that we hopefully will constantly be able to perform. That's also one of the reasons why for the time being we are using UBAM Libya located for the time being due to security reasons in Tunis as kind of a clearinghouse through which we also channel all those activities. The training I mentioned was in the context of search and rescue, where there are international obligations where they should be present. But we could maybe continue the discussion later on. The situation there is of a nature that we have to go to start somewhere. Thank you very much.